Good evening. It is Monday, January 31st, 2022. This is the Guilford Board of Education's Curriculum, Instruction, and Assessment Committee. We are very excited tonight to have Dr. Dawn Seiler joining us this evening. I will note this is rescheduled from last Monday, so we thank Dr. Seiler and our audience for your patience. We had to reschedule due to technical difficulties last Monday. I am opening the meeting as the chair of the board. However, one of the early agenda items this evening is going to be to elect a new chair of this Curriculum, Instruction, and Assessment Committee, as Dr. Mary Best, who was with us the last 4 years, but is no longer on the board, was the prior chair. The first order of business, actually, though, I'm going to ask for a motion to move around the beginning agenda just slightly. I'd like to ask if someone would make a motion to move the approval of our last committee minutes to be the first item, that then we elect a chair, and then we dive into the content for this evening. So is there a motion to change the agenda to move approval to minutes to number 2 and elect chair to number 3?
So moved.
Second.
Excellent. All in favor? Aye. Wonderful. So I am going to name that our new committee, as new members have joined our board this year, that the Committee for the Curriculum, Instruction, and Assessment is Dick Hirsch, Arnold Skreda, Christy Faulkner, Jen Baldwin, Kristen Peck, and Noel Petra. I see 5 of those folks in attendance tonight. The first item on the agenda is to approve the minutes from May 24th, 2021. For those of us who were there and on the presently among the people I just named who were at that meeting, you should feel free to approve or oppose the minutes as you see fit. And then I'll ask the newest members to simply abstain. So I'm going to ask for a motion to approve the minutes of May 24th, 2021 for the Curriculum, Instruction, and Assessment Committee.
So moved.
Second.
Okay. Moira, sorry, I'm actually going to need someone on the committee. Kristen, are you able?
Correct.
Okay, thanks. Any corrections to these minutes? All right, seeing none, we have a motion and a second. Of the committee members, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Okay, so we have Dick and Kristen as the chair. I'm going to include myself. That's 3. All opposed? And any abstentions? Okay, so 3 abstentions, Arnold Skreda, Jennifer Baldwin, and Christy Faulkner. Thank you. The second item on the agenda is to elect a chair for this committee. Is there a nomination for chair for this committee? Go ahead, Kristen.
Hi, I would like to nominate Dr. Hirsch as chair of this committee. I think Dr. Hirsch has proven over his tenure here on the board his commitment to the Guilford students, and he obviously has a very long career in education, so I think he's quite qualified to help us lead our curriculum education board.
Excellent. Are there any other nominations? Okay, seeing none, may I have a second for that nomination, please?
Second.
Arnold Skreda, I see a second. Thank you. So all those in favor of nominating Dr. Hirsch to chair the Curriculum, Instruction, and Assessment Committee among the committee members, please raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Excellent. All right. So I am now going to turn the meeting over to Dr. Hirsch in his new capacity as chair.
Great. Thank you. I move we adjourn. Let me introduce Dr. Crystal, who will introduce our guest more formally for those who are viewing audience tonight. So Dr. Crystal, would you do that, please?
Thank you, Dr. Hirsch. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Don Seiler. He's a professor at the University of St. Joseph, and he is with us tonight to share his report after working with some of our faculty and members of the staff. In the district, he is bringing to us a report on culture and pedagogy in the Guilford Public Schools. So, Dr. Seiler, I'm just going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Crystal. Give me one moment. Let me just share my screen. I'm just going to walk you through the main points of the report. My hope is that it will clarify some things, but it will also give us an opportunity afterwards to have a little bit of a conversation and answer any questions you might have about the methodology or about any of the information that I was able to get through my work with the district. So this work is, we're coming up on the second year of doing this work within Guilford. So I want to walk you through a few things. First of all, the purpose of this report is to continue the work that Guilford has set forth, but also the work that Connecticut's Department of Education has set forth with their focus on engaging in culturally responsive pedagogy and engaging in teaching and curriculum that will benefit all students, recognizing that in the past there have been some groups within our student population whose outcomes and whose experiences are disparate from the majority of our students. So this is an effort to continue what Guilford and what Connecticut has promised to the students. We're also looking to explore and better understand the specific experiences of students in the district, how they are perceiving their experiences in the district. But I also wanted to, or I was also asked to examine the role of school environment, curriculum, pedagogy in those experiences. In order to do so, I needed to look at a couple of different sets of information. First, I'm going to talk back and forth about my experiences working with teachers and faculty and my experiences working with students themselves. Working with teachers and instructional coaches, I met with the instructional coaches. We had a full day session. It was a very long session. It was one of those, one of the first live sessions where everyone was masked. So this was, at least 5 hours of just talking and discussing different ideas and what they wanted to be able to do and what I was going to be able to help support them in doing. I also met with grades 5 through 12 ELA and social studies teachers. For them, we met at least twice. We met twice. The first time I shared specific information similar to what I shared with the instructional coaches. That included ideas around culturally responsive pedagogy, ideas around differentiation, multiple intelligences, using arts in the classroom to meet the needs of students. The second session that I had with the teachers, with the large group of teachers, was actually, I don't want to call it a feedback session. I think that's minimizing. There was a session wherein the teachers could actually start talking about what they have been doing, what other supports they need, what ideas they had so they could get specific pedagogical suggestions. And that was part of me moving from the role of someone who's there to give them information to a support. And that's kind of my ongoing role here, is being a support to the students and being a support to the administration and the faculty. I've also obviously had ongoing meetings with district administration. For the most part, those meetings have been guiding my work in terms of letting me know what the district wanted, but it's also been, they've also done a really good job of helping me to understand that their emphasis and their focus on looking out for all of their students is genuine. So that I wanted to make sure that I mentioned that in this conversation, that I've never felt like they were trying to censor what I had to say. I've never felt like they had a specific agenda. I've always genuinely felt that the goal of the administration was, what can we do that's going to be best for our students? Other ongoing work that we have, or that I've done, is I've reviewed the district curriculum and reviewed teacher evaluation documents, The curriculum that I mainly focus on was social studies and English language arts. Reviewed teacher evaluation documents, reviewed the instructional coaching documents, and also during one of the meetings with the teachers, we discussed them engaging in an audit of their, I'll throw audits in quotes, a review of their resources, not to see what they needed to get rid of, but to see if there were things that they wanted to be able to bring in, but that they needed support in bringing in. So looking at concepts, looking at whether or not they are sharing as many perspectives as they wanted to share in their classes. So they were going to go back and look at their content, look at their resources, look at the way that they were teaching, and see whether or not there are areas where they're already really doing well or areas in which they needed some support. So I want to get through this part relatively quickly. In terms of the faculty, the themes that came out of my work with them, and once again, when I say themes, I'm saying through collecting my notes and looking at what teachers talked about, the concepts or ideas that kept recurring, the things that they kept discussing, they kept mentioning, they kept asking me questions about. The first one that came up over and over again was they want to engage in this type of work, but they want to do it correctly. They want to do it in a way that does not do harm. They want to do it in a way that is going to still be academically sound. They want to do the work in a way that is acceptable according to the curriculum, but also according to the guidelines that they have in their specific schools or in their specific learning groups. So that might sound like a negative idea, but what it really is that there is a conscientiousness in the teachers where they want to be able to do what they know is better for their students, but they don't want to engage it without thinking about it. They don't want to engage it without some support, some background information. They want to know that they are doing the things, that these things that they're doing that are well-intentioned are not problematic, are not harming students, or are not, I don't want to say less useful, but are not, they want to make sure that what they're doing is actually useful and actually benefits the students. The second theme that came from the teachers, the faculty, and I'm including the instructional coaches here as well, is the eagerness. In every single meeting, they ask questions. And the questions were never, why do I have to do this? This is, why is this so frustrating? Why is it so hard? They expressed that, like, let's go, let's get going. All right, when do we meet with you next? When can we ask more questions? When can you provide us this? When can you? So there was an eagerness for them to engage in a type of teaching that they felt was more holistic. I think that's a good word or a good way to think about what we're trying to accomplish here. So that eagerness was pretty evident across all of the teacher groups. Another thing that came from working with the teachers was they want to know that it is okay to try things. And it was not an accusation that there wasn't existing support from administration, from principals, from anyone. They just want to know that they're not going to get in trouble, that they're not going to be disciplined in any way, not necessarily by the district themselves. They're really worried that moving forward with this work, as I mentioned before, they want to do it right, they're eager to do it, but they also want to know that when they try things, when they work on things, when they engage in things, they're not going to be undercut. They're going to hear yeses from the administration within reason, obviously. I'm sure there are going to be some ideas that a teacher brings forward that just aren't necessarily appropriate, or you may run into issues with resources. They just want to know that the support is there, and they also want guidance. So this goes along with the not doing it wrong. They want to know, how is this supposed to be incorporated? Should this be a separate thing? A couple of folks mentioned it in the context of introduction of SEL into classrooms. where in some spaces people are introducing social emotional learning. Pardon me. In some spaces, people are introducing social emotional learning as a separate thing, separate lesson, separate experiences for students. And in other places, SEL is being introduced as something that is a core part of the content itself. So the SEL lesson actually is embedded in the social studies lesson as opposed to being separate. So teachers want guidance in terms of engaging in culturally responsive pedagogy, in terms of using new resources. They want to know how to do it correctly. Part of that would come from me, but they also want to have a clear message from the district to say, this is what we are supposed to be doing. And then the last thing that I noticed, the last thing that came from the data is pretty consistently, the teachers themselves are already engaging in some really healthy, thoughtful practices. And this is part of the reason that we engaged in the curriculum review, the curriculum review that the teachers engaged in was because one thing that's really important when it comes to doing equity work, doing any work that is intended to address a broad set of needs, is that you need to start from where folks are. So it would be really useless for me to come in and say, hey, teachers, I'm going to fix you. Hey, teachers, I'm going to tell you how to do your job. Some of these people have been teaching, half of my life. Maybe I'm pretty old, so probably not my whole life. But pretty consistently, the teachers themselves are already engaging in really thoughtful work. They're talking, and you'll notice at some point in the report, there's actually a small list. That list is very small in comparison to the actual documentation I have where I was writing notes about all of the different ways that they're already trying to engage students. So we had conversations from everything the one that always sticks out to me is a teacher who wanted to engage Melville, but to look at whaling and look at maritime literature from different perspectives. So we had a conversation about Inuit and Japanese and how these different cultures view whaling. So the ideas are already there. Folks are already having conversations. Folks are already trying to teach their students. A lot of them just need support, and some of them just needed to hear that they're doing it right, or that they're doing well, or that they are, going the right direction. And that's part of the guidance and support. Moving on to working with the students themselves, I want to be very clear about the process that we decided upon in terms of working with students and why we decided on that process. In order to work with the students, number one, part of this work was a response to some of the incidents that had happened in Guilford previously. I know you had a student who showed up in blackface. You had some other things happen with anti-Semitism there at the school. And this was not unique to Guilford specifically, but the whole point of me talking to students and not just working with teachers was we wanted to understand what the experiences of students were like, specifically minoritized students. When you have a school district where the minoritized students or the marginalized students make up such a small number, it is very, very, very easy for their voices to be drowned out. It is impossible to meet the needs of all students if you can't hear some of them. So we were very intentional in making sure that at the beginning of this process, we were trying to decide how we would be able to make sure that we were hearing a broad array of voices, but then making sure that we also were honest about the fact that we needed to address the needs or listen to the experiences of some of the most underrepresented students or the smallest percentage of students in the district. In order to do that, we started with two large groups. The first large group was about 30 students. That group intentionally included students of varying backgrounds. That included students who are on the LGBTQI spectrum. That included students who identify as white, students who identify, and all of the student identities and identifications were self-identifications. So we didn't make any suggestions for these first two groups. We didn't suggest or say what race the students had to be. We wanted to be able to have a group of students who were interested in or had questions about this type of work, the equity work that was supposed to be happening in the district. So in that first group of about 30 students, we asked questions in order to establish a pretty good baseline for the way that they were experiencing district. We asked questions about their feelings of being welcome or unwelcome in the school and in the community itself. So we asked them questions, and this was a semi-structured interview format. So we allowed the students to have some freedom within the questions instead of going from question 1 to question 2 to question 3. So ask questions about where areas in the school and district where they felt welcome and in the community as well. Overall district environment, what type of environment did they think the district was promoting, or did they feel like the district was? Any distinctions in specific schools, subjects, classrooms, where students felt more or less welcome, or they felt their needs were being more or less met or engaged. The second meeting, we narrowed it down to look more specifically at Black and Hispanic students. Did that intentionally as well. Number one, because the Black student population is very, very small in your school district, but also there is a general correlation. There's some correlations between the experiences of students who are, I don't want to get into the whole idea of model minority. There are some very specific things that are similar in the experiences of Black and Hispanic students when it comes to our education system. Graduation rates are similar, test score issues are similar, and also their identity, their identification is oftentimes a little bit more visually noticeable. So that also plays a role in terms of how they're experiencing that school space. So that's the reason that we chose that group. That was a much smaller group. That group of students was asked to share experience that they felt were distinct to their groups. And that group was very interesting. The first group surprised me. The second group was really interesting. And I'll elaborate in just a moment. We did the 2 interviews with the Black students, at least in part because we were making sure that we, especially as things have gone in this country, culturally, racially, socially, we wanted to make sure that this population that makes up a pretty small percentage of your school district was having their voices heard, to ensure that the things that we were doing was not ignoring these voices that would be fairly easy to overlook just based on the numbers themselves. Those students were asked a little bit more specific questions, brought in questions about their family's perspective on education. I did not include in the report, but there is a pretty good body of research that suggests that teacher perception of family views of education affects the way that they interact with students. So it's always important when you're talking to minoritized students to have a conversation around, to kind of make it very clear that their family's view of education is usually just as rich or just as well considered as anyone else's experiences or anyone else's perspectives. Family discussion on culture. How did their family view culture? How did their family discuss culture? Their specific experiences in the district. Some of that was intentionally redundant, just to see, and I'll explain that in just one moment. The students' own growth and development in the school district, to have a conversation with them about, it's really important not to frame these conversations in a way that paints the students as an eternal victim or somebody to whom something is happening. Because what it does is, even if it has noble intent, what it can do is it removes their agency. So having a conversation with those students about their own growth and their own development and the opportunities that they've taken to address challenges. And another way that I tried to do that was having a conversation with those students about what they would like to see different for future Guilford students and what role they wanted to take in that difference. Now, this question was asked of each group, but the responses in the 2 individual interviews were much more specific, whereas when the question was asked in the larger groups, you'll see from some of the themes that I share, the question became a lot more general. It wasn't as specific. And So the themes that I noted with the students themselves, I mentioned to you that the meetings themselves were very distinct and very, they all had their own tone. The meeting with the 30 students, what happened with that meeting, and this is not a negative by any stretch of the conversation. What happened in that meeting is exactly what can happen in the schools when you don't make sure that you are being intentional about hearing voices, hearing the minoritized and marginalized voices. In that meeting, the students who identified as white, whether they also identified as Jewish or identified as gay, or there were a few trans students. I mean, we had students all over the spectrum. Those students tended to speak more. Now, they did outnumber the Black and brown students, but their voice tended to be heard more. None of it was intentionally talking over. None of it was intended to be hurtful. But I just wanted to make sure that I pointed that out. One of the big themes was that the Black and Hispanic students, when they talked about their experiences, they mirrored each other. They actually started bouncing off each other. And that was something that I noticed that was different from the first meeting to the second meeting. In the first meeting, the students were very cordial, very thoughtful, very engaged. But there was a very clear, take your turn, take your turn. With the Black and Latinx, Black and Hispanic student group, there was much more of a give and take. The mood shifted, the way that they spoke about things. There was actually something that I did not put in as a theme, even though it did occur, was the fact that they made their shared traumas into things that they could laugh about. Not because those things were not as serious, but because it helped them to connect and it helped them to feel safer in that space. So the Black and Hispanic student experiences, when they discussed them, were very, very similar. That was very consistent. Another theme was the fact that students in all three groups, in the large group, in the 8-student group, as well as in the individual interviews, mentioned that it is clear to them that teachers and some of the curriculum and the pedagogy is putting forth an effort. What they express some frustration with is when those efforts are being what they consider to be censored. When they feel like those efforts are being sanitized, they find it problematic. As a bit of an aside, it's difficult when you're talking about middle school and high school students. When I was a child, middle school and high school, we misbehaved, but for the most part, we were still small kids, especially in middle school. With the ubiquity of digital technology and social media, it's really difficult. There are studies being done right now about the effects that these different things, these different influences are having on maturity and adolescence and how children go through adolescence. But one thing that was very clear is that students feel like when the content is being sanitized, they feel, none of them said the word insulted, but they notice and they have a problem. They don't necessarily want to have a conversation about the Holocaust that stops at something bad happened and then America won the war. That's not enough. I did not get the sense that these students were asking for morbidity. I did not get the sense that these students were asking for things that were going to be dark and painful. But what they do want is they want to see and hear and know what happened in clear terms. They want to be respected. That was very clear. Another thing that came out, the third bullet I'm going across the top. I apologize for not making it clear. Is that they also notice that the teachers are well-intentioned. They get the sense that the teachers want to do this work. But what I mentioned before in terms of teachers being worried about not doing the work correctly, the students sense that. That came out in the conversation with students, that they notice that some teachers try it, but they don't always try it. So there are situations in which a teacher will start to talk about a difficult topic and then pull back, or where a teacher will listen to a student's perspective on something, but then kind of shut the conversation down, which will lead to one of the other bullets here. Another one is the idea of neutrality doing harm. All of the students in each of the groups mentioned that when a teacher attempts to take a neutral, quote unquote, objective perspective on a subject, what it does is it puts weight back on the students. It limits conversation. It goes against some of the district and Connecticut conversations about the importance of critical discussion and critical analysis and critical thinking. But the students themselves said when a teacher is neutral on something like a conversation around using racial slurs, when a teacher tries to take a middle ground approach and say, well, there are some people who don't like it and there are some people who think it should be okay, that is actively doing harm to a student for whom that racial slur is painful. That was one of the examples that students used. Along the same lines, in the bottom row, first on your left, Black students bearing the weight that is not their own. In the 8-student meeting, as well as in the individual interviews, Black students repeatedly mentioned the fact that since the district itself, or since teachers themselves try to be neutral or try not to get in trouble, they bear the weight of needing to address racism in the school. They bear the weight of needing to tell a peer, you shouldn't say that word. They bear the weight of saying, that's not what the Holocaust was, that's not what slavery was. They bear the weight of needing to help peers understand it. And this is not always an antagonistic situation. This is not always somebody doing something disrespectful. This is peers asking Black students if they can use the well-known racial slur in the context of music. That still is putting weight on the students, the Black students, to be the arbiters of that language. This also comes across in terms of Black students needing to address whether or not something was racist. So the students themselves have indicated that they feel the weight of needing to do that because the district is not necessarily clear, or teachers are not clear. Teachers are trying to be safe, the district is trying to be safe, and meanwhile, the harm that is occurring is this leads to the next bullet, which is avoiding tough conversations and outcomes comes across as condone. I, as a profession, understand that school districts cannot tell students, they cannot automatically tell students what discipline was meted out to other students. There are all kinds of different reasons why you can't tell one student what happened to another student. But when it just disappears, from the administrative standpoint or from the teacher standpoint, when it just disappears, the students of color, the minoritized students are feeling like the district is saying that it's okay. Because if the consequences, and I want to be very clear here, I don't think consequences as in punishment are always the answer. But when the outcomes are not clear to the student who is struggling or the student who has been harmed, then it seems like school is basically saying, that's on you. You were hurt, you felt bad, you have to deal with that. It makes it seem like the school district is condoning. And again, I want to be very clear. This is not my opinion. This is not me saying what I think happened. I took the data that the students gave me, I analyzed that data for the repeated themes, the things that they talked about the most, the things that they expressed the most. The next one is students in all groups expressed a sincere affinity, a sincere love for the district, for the community. There were some students who were transplants who came from other areas who, even if they noted that their time at the beginning was problematic and difficult and things were hard, they still love the district. I don't know what y'all are doing there that just makes them, but the expression of love was consistent. None of them said, I hate this district, I want to leave, I can't stand it. And as someone who's worked with multiple previous school districts, that is not common. It's not common in general. It is especially not common when you're talking about the minoritized and marginalized students. I'm not putting that in there so that y'all feel better about your work. What I'm saying is that the students repeated this over and over again in each set of meetings. I would ask one question and they would say, I love Guilford. I just wish that. And that kept happening. They kept saying, I love it here. I enjoy this. I've made all of my lifelong friends here. Lots of reasons that they love the district. Another theme that I'll talk about briefly is in these groups, specifically in the Latinx and Black groups, their conversations around family and culture were really poignant. They kept talking about their family and the importance of their family and their family's desire for them to get a good education and how their family's view of them and the district. So their families moved to the district specifically for their benefit. And that's a different type of investment. So I think it's very important to recognize that for that group of students, they see the investment that their family has made to get them into this district. They also see the importance of education through their family's eyes. So I wanted to be very clear that that was another theme that came up that wasn't necessarily something that I was expecting, because we tried to stick to curriculum, pedagogy, school environment, but that theme kept coming up for the students. And I only have a couple more. So my recommendations in the report, again, none of these are, I kind of think this would be fun if you did this. All of these recommendations are based on the data that I collected working with the students, working with the teachers. They're also based on the themes that I've already mentioned. Hopefully that's pretty clear. The recommendations that I suggest, first, the administration has to do a better job of making their support for teachers clear, not in terms of we support our teachers, but specifically, we understand the type of work that our teachers are going to be engaging in. We are going to be flexible. We are going to allow those teachers a space to try things. We're also going to provide them with more supports and more trainings, which leads to the second bullet point, which is that from my perspective, the only way you're going to be able to do that in a way that teachers will trust and feel safe, that teachers will feel like they can actually engage in this critical work that we're talking about, is through an actual revision of policy. Looking at the policy itself, looking at the language in the policy, and making it very clear that this is something that the district has an emphasis on, but again, that it's not some secondary thing that you're doing to add a load on for the teachers. This is just a core aspect of the district's work. It's already discussed as a core aspect of Connecticut's education. The third thing would be teacher evaluation criteria. Another way to show the teachers that you support them would be making sure that they understand that the evaluations, the way that they're evaluated, are going to be considering of all of these innovations, all of the things that they are doing, the ways that they are making things better for their students. There were several areas in the teacher evaluation criteria that were very good, but there are also some areas that don't make it very clear the value of the work that they're doing. Another recommendation that I make, and this is partially based, this is based on research, but it's the general idea that, let me backtrack just a moment. I know that Guilford and other school districts have heard from former students who, when they got out into the world, were not necessarily feeling like they had a really clear understanding of what everything was going to be like, what college is going to be like, what working in the profession is going to be like. Part of the thing that has been found in other school districts is that having only teachers who look a certain way or only teachers from a certain background, it's very difficult for students to start to see and understand the different roles that different groups of people can play in society. Another aspect of minoritized teacher recruitment is that you're allowing for students of color and students who are on the LGBTQI spectrum, brown students, English language learning students, you're allowing them to actually see themselves and being able to actually see their culture as a professional in the profession. part of teacher recruitment is letting people see how they can see themselves as teachers. So this is almost a kind of a self-fulfilling recommendation. Recruiting minoritized teachers benefits all students because it shows students more backgrounds for the people that they are going to see as role models, but it also benefits the marginalized and minoritized students specifically. Family outreach, in this, I know that the district has already engaged a liaison for this, but I think making it very clear and consistent that family outreach is an aspect of the work that Guilford is going to be doing. So one of the things I say in my classes is part of good differentiation and good culturally responsive sustaining pedagogy is lessening the cognitive and emotional distances between home life and school life. When students have to walk in the door and switch themselves off because they can't think the way they think at home, what you're actually having them do is leave aspects of their identity outside the school walls. That is more damaging for some students than other students, but it's not good for any students. So with family outreach, what you're trying to do is lessen the distance, that distance between their home life and their school life, so that the school community becomes even more more welcoming to all of the students. Another suggestion or recommendation is student parent alumni panels. This has been done at other schools. The goal of having student alumni and parent panels is bringing in folks who live in the district, bringing in folks who have gone to the district, and bringing in students who are currently in the district, just to hear what their experiences are, just to hear what their questions are, what their thoughts are, to make sure that we're putting a face to the things that we're trying to address. This has, every time that I've engaged in these panels, I've moderated several, the response is pretty universally good. Teachers have an opportunity to be reminded of who they're working with and why they're doing the work. But the other side of it is that when a alumnus comes in and talks about how wonderful their experience was, even if they talk about for a few minutes about how they struggled with this one thing, inevitably it keeps coming back to, yeah, but there was this one teacher, oh, but there was this one experience, there was this one class. So what ends up happening is you have parents and family members and students feeling heard, which affects them feeling welcome and safe in that space and their investment and engagement in that space. You also have teachers oftentimes feeling like they see the value of the work. They get to know and see and feel that their work matters and their work makes a difference. Going along with that, especially as it pertains to things like policy and teacher evaluation revisions, would be focus groups. And in this situation, you could bring in even more stakeholders. You could have parents, you could have community members, folks who work in the district, but you want to make sure that the stakeholder group is pretty diverse. You don't want to just have a room full of administrators, so you don't want to just pull in a bunch of principals. You don't want to just have, 5 parents and one student, or pardon me, 5 parents and then one community person who's not a parent. You want to make sure that you're intentionally setting it up so that you're hearing from multiple voices as you're engaging in these more specific revisions. Making the aggrieved whole. As I mentioned before, when you have students who feel like they are bearing extra weight, when you have students who are worried that the district is condoning the erasure of culture, when you have students who feel like the district might be condoning hurtful behavior, there has to be a way, understanding once again that you can't tell other students what happened with one student's disciplinary record. There has to be a way, and I stopped short of suggesting restorative practices because those are their own thing, but there has to be a way that the district discusses making the aggrieved students whole. Not necessarily just putting out a statement after something happens, but ensuring that students don't walk away wondering whether or not the district is okay with something that happened. That can't be up in the air. And then the last thing is just a continued curriculum review, curriculum and pedagogy review, mainly from the perspective of where do teachers stand, what do they want to do, and how do they want to move forward. At this point, most of it is in teachers' hands. My goal is to continue supporting teachers and continue looking at what they have found in terms of looking at their own work, looking at their own content. But that has to be ongoing. We've only looked at ELA and social studies at this point. I know that math and science have a tendency to seem much harder in terms of engaging this kind of work, but it's all accessible, it's all possible. And once again, I want to make sure that I'm being very clear about the overall conclusion of this report, or the overall findings of this report. The optimism from students, from teachers, from the administration has been consistent. I don't always expect that every tier of a school district is going to have a similar perspective of the district. Oftentimes what you'll find is that somebody in the student group hates the district. It's a struggle because they've had bad experiences, and the district becomes kind of the avatar for those experiences. In this case, everybody that I spoke to expressed an optimism for what can happen and a genuine care about the district. The conversation around equity does not stop at just what can I do with my one class. It's blossomed into more a community conversation. How to develop a more inclusive and a more thoughtful and a more caring environment for all students and teachers. The curriculum and teachers seem to embrace critical thinking and growth. I look at curriculum the same way I look at standards, not as a set of goals, but as a set of baselines. So to have critical thinking and growth as a baseline is actually a really good starting point. How does that look? And making sure that is sincerely engaged is really, really important. And then one of the main things that I wanted to leave you all with is the fact that students, administrators, teachers, instructional coaches, everybody that I spoke to or worked with, to a person, expressed a desire to participate in making things better for everybody. So there was no conversation where it was like, I don't like this group, I don't like these people. It was all consistently, everybody has said, I want to participate in making the district even better than the current year. So you go from the first bullet point to the last bullet point. They already love the district. They already love being there and see things can be better. They all also want to play a role. So when it comes to those experience panels, when it comes to focus groups, I do not think you would have a hard time finding people who want to participate, because the investment in this town, this district is pretty clear across the board. So I may have spoken more than I planned to speak, but I think I covered everything. So I would love to open it up to questions that y'all might have.
Well, thank you for that. The asset of having a week from our last meeting, which was canceled, and being able to read your report demonstrated that the report is rich, but your presentation in these bullet points, I think, was very succinct. You've clearly honored the spirit, I think, of what we're looking for. And I assume we'll have access to your PowerPoint, so we can use that as a reference point. But thank you for this. I thought that you had been incredibly diplomatic in your report, as well as tonight, but specific enough and constructive enough that there's plenty of work that we have before us, without feeling that it's either too ambiguous or too general. With that, the rest of the board members might want to ask questions. Jen.
Thank you. And thank you very much for that presentation. That was I just loved reading the report and having your insight. I am a new member to the board. I was only elected in November, so I wasn't there when this was initially instituted. I just have a question, and I don't know who's best to answer this. Is there a reason special education was not included as a minority group within the district? Or,
And
I
don't
guess
know if you-
marginalized. Sorry.
So I did not ask if any of the students were, so the students all self-identified. So since none of them identified themselves as, having IEPs or 504, I didn't ask. So there was a pretty good chance that there were some students in there. But I will say that any equity work has to include special education students, students with physical disability, any accessibility issues whatsoever. But mostly, for the most part, it was probably because the students didn't identify, and that could be a social factor as well. Any work going forward, that is absolutely part of the work going forward. Yes, and I thank you for that question. Actually.
Christy.
I just want to thank you as well. That was just very informative. And I really just, anytime I can hear the perspective of the students and the teachers that just came through so clearly in what you just presented, it's just appreciated. And I guess this is just a bigger question we're going to all be discussing. It's really, I guess, for Dr. Freeman and Dr. Crystal, any ideas of how we address this feeling among the teachers of having them feel comfortable and supported? Does that look like professional development? Does that look like a coach who's someone who helps them understand how to tackle some of these discussions? What does that look like moving forward?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. Thank you. It starts by further conversation about this report and specifically about that slide that identifies recommendations, right? That slide could also very much have been labeled next steps. And so what we need to do is we need to continue to have conversations about that slide in larger and in smaller settings, right? The community needs to talk about what that slide means. We as board, you as the board with us, the administrators need to talk about what next steps. And I think the board recognized in some of those, we've already initiated or started some small steps in those directions. And in others, we haven't spoken about them at all. But it also means going into the buildings and sitting with teachers and talking about those recommendations and asking the question, what more do you need to feel more supported, rather than us deciding and just putting something in place. What I have discovered over the last 18 months is that there's a real dichotomy in how different constituencies are recognizing this conversation. I think in the community and certainly at the sort of very high political level, it feels like this is all we've been talking about for the last 16 months. And the teachers at the classroom are actually feeling like we've been doing this for a long time, but we haven't really talked about anything new in the last 18 months. And so we need to bridge that gap. I think we need to help some in the community feel that this is not a significant, big, radical change. In the report, Dr. Seiler pointed out that the social studies and ELA curricula that were both approved in 16 and 17 are solid, and he's not making big, wholesale, radical curricular recommendations. But we need to sit with the teachers and say, if that's a solid foundation, what do you need from us to feel that support? And I really appreciate the policy recommendation, because we can promise the teachers that we're with them and that this is what we want them doing. We can provide some more coaching support and some more professional learning support, but seeing it codified in policy is an important step. And I really do appreciate, I thought that was a particularly thoughtful recommendation that we need to really be considering moving forward. Christy, I think that gets there, right? We don't just go from the 8 recommendations to a quick list. There's more conversation to be had, but I'm really excited about those conversations. And we've done this in the past. We've done it with a report from Dr. James Borland out of Columbia University about how we're supporting talented and gifted kids. I think almost 12 years ago now, we did it with recommendations around special education in the district, and that led to some really significant structural changes. We're good at taking outside prodding and figuring out how to use that locally to make thoughtful changes. We need to do more of that.
Katie.
Dr. Seiler, thank you. This is very important themes that you share with us tonight. There are several I could touch on. One of them, though, I guess I wanted to note, obviously the perhaps cyclical nature or the impasse that is created by teachers who feel the need to be overly careful, my words, not yours, and students who are looking for more, and in your words, or in their words, feeling, and maybe I'm not paraphrasing well, but what I heard was feeling that we are perhaps underestimating their ability to take on this content, this being somewhat amorphous in my statement here, but content and instruction and learning. And I appreciate that. I've been concerned all along that we are not giving our students credit for their ability to engage in thoughtful discussion around sometimes challenging topics. And I think for me, it was important to hear, and correct me if I've said anything incorrectly, to hear from you that that you're hearing that, or you heard that from students as well.
Yeah, and to be clear, once again, I think I alluded to it earlier. The students are not suggesting that they need to watch atrocities. We have videos of atrocities. The thing is, they've seen those videos. They've seen some pretty harsh things. The shows that they watch are pretty challenging, and they have to be able to understand that. The things that they see on social media. One of the biggest distinctions right now that I think a lot of us lose is that even if you're in your 30s right now, the ubiquity of media is different now. When I was younger, you watched the news at night, you watched primetime TV shows, or you watched cartoons, or you watched like Happy Days reruns during the daytime. Now students have all the information, all the shows, everything is constant. I mean, you turn on TNT in the morning and there's SVU, Law and Order SVU at 7 o'clock in the morning. It's very difficult to keep today's children, especially adolescents and teens. It's very difficult to keep them away from topics. So I'm not suggesting that the school needs to like pop on an episode of SVU. That would be completely inappropriate. But what I am saying is that from the student's perspective, and I think you did word it correctly, they want the respect of being trusted to understand and be able to process. If you're going to have critical thinking and analysis of resources as a part of your curriculum, then they need to be able to actually engage in that. They can't be engaged in the process of, well, this bad thing happened, but we're going to keep you safe from it. They need to understand the bad thing happened. That does not mean you need to be salacious. It does not have to be salacious. Now, even that term, depending on who's defining it, can be questionable. But I think back to, was it 20 years ago when there was an entire campaign to put a fig leaf over the genitalia of the Michelangelo's David replica that was going around on tour. And for some people, it was like, you cannot have this naked statue. It is disgusting. It's inappropriate. Yet it's a masterwork of classical art, of Renaissance art. So there is this idea that we want to protect children and students from obscenity, from inappropriate things. But if we're not clearly defining what is appropriate and what isn't appropriate, then what happens is the teachers feel like they need to be the arbiters, and then they pull back because they have families and lives and jobs that they want to protect. So then the students feel disrespected because the teachers are doing what any person would do when they don't feel comfortable taking that next step. So in terms of what the parameters are going to be, that's something that the focus groups and any conversations that y'all have would have to decide on. How do you determine what the parameters are? But the students notice, you're absolutely right. The students notice when things are sanitized and they feel disrespected, and it increases that separation between their lived everyday experience and their school experience, which has all kinds of different kind of cascading effects throughout their education. Sorry, that was a very long response.
Well, no, but and Dr. Seiler and Dr. Bellistraci, I think you both also mentioned that critical thinking doesn't mean adopting forced or false equivalencies or a neutrality. And that's going to be a difficult conversation moving forward. But the best example of that happened recently when a poor principal in Texas, feeling all the pressures that you're describing now, said out loud to her faculty to remember that when you present the Holocaust, to present both sides. And that drew national press. But I understand what that principal was struggling hard to do. The principal was trying to adopt this idea of critical thinking, and we present the facts and the students come to their own meaning. But there is no neutrality around the facts of the Holocaust. You can't do that. And if we overdo the idea of adopting a neutral position, it leads to students who are feeling unsupported, as you mentioned, and teachers feeling unsure or safe. And so, again, I pick an extreme example because extreme examples are easy to find the ground, right? There are more nuanced examples, and that's going to Christy's point, involve a lot of conversation with teachers as they tease out and find those places where they can speak truth, but also provide opportunities for critical thinking for their students. I hope I said all that well.
If I could, Dr. Hirsch, sorry, and then I will cede the floor to someone else. On top of that, Dr. Freeman, right? Another thing, Dr. Sarwa, that you said is that that teachers need to feel supported, particularly in trying new things. Teachers try new things on a regular basis, but likely with topics that are less charged in the larger community for sure. And so we've got to, I hear you, and we'll have to work on figuring out how to really create a confidence or a trust so that teachers feel like they can try things. Things will not always go right the first time. But there's just I guess that resonated with me as well, that comment.
Something important to keep in mind along those same lines is that when the teachers expressed a desire for support for innovation, I didn't get the sense that any of them were saying, just let me go off and do whatever I want to do. I know for a fact, and you can find it in any newspaper, there are situations all across the country where a teacher will think that they're innovating, but then they're actually just being more offensive or they're being more problematic. So that's part of the reason that having policy and having very clearly stated supports means that the teachers will be able to bounce ideas off, and they also have some basic parameters or basic guidelines for what's expected. And that's the purpose. That's the kind of goal here. It's not to say, hey, teachers, go do whatever you want, but making sure that they understand that within reason or within certain parameters or within certain boundings, they have the space to try new and different things.
Christy?
Thanks, Dick. So just I noticed that it's grades specifically 5 through 12 for this report. Is there a plan to also address the younger grades? I know, for a lot of us, early intervention is the key word for so many things. And I would just imagine that a lot of good could come by starting this as soon as possible. I also understand that the state requirements, I believe, are K through 12. So is there a plan moving forward?
There's intention and there's commitment if there isn't an articulated plan at this time. But yes, the goal is to continue to do this work. The elementary level, the subjects are more integrated together. The elementary teachers, we're dealing with other initiatives this year, phonics initiatives, right? But yes, the answer and the intent is yes.
Moira?
Thank you, Dick. Dr. Seiler, thank you for this report. Thank you for, really speaking to hearing the students in particular. And I mean, obviously the staff, it was really important, but I had two connections that I wanted to ask you more about, just because I'm sure you're aware that in the last year or so, and in many communities around the US, we've been dealing with kind of a community that doesn't necessarily agree on the direction that we are heading in it as a district. And so two things that really stuck with me is one of your individual interviews, the students said, well, this is based on familial influence and cultural influence at home versus cultural influence at school. And they said while they aren't expected to ignore racism, they're expected to move past it in order to achieve their educational goals. And they're speaking about family, their own family, kind of creating this expectation or importance to education and kind of ignoring the racism to kind of get to the educational goal. And then later on, you speak about family outreach. And then the students' repeated feelings of needing to distance themselves from their core aspect of their identity in order to better fit in at school. And I know just for me personally, it created a whole other level of empathy for these students if I didn't already know it internally. But in thinking about that, and that's the reality of these students when they're leaving home and coming to school, and it's almost having to put on another, like not a facade, but another kind of personality or identity. How do we as a community better understand that this isn't about we're right and you're wrong, and reaching, because you talk about reaching out to family and having these conversations. You had a really good term for it. I can't find it here. These panels, these kind of sharing panels, or we can bring community together to talk about, experience panels. So how could we take, that example of that student that you interviewed and connect better with our community and our families to help them better understand that reality? Because I think if more of our community can understand that, I don't think there'd be as much resistance. And I'm just speaking, I'm curious to hear your opinion on that.
Oh, so I'll step a little bit outside of the report proper, just to give you a little more context. But it's almost like saying it's a chicken and egg situation. The problem that a lot of folks are dealing with is that the education system has not heard or considered or addressed the needs of these voices and these students. Therefore, it's hard for people who came through the education system, universally, to then empathize, because we've been told and taught that everybody gets the same education. This is the land of equality. And I'm not suggesting that there is not some equality in the district. What I'm saying is that as it pertains to these students, as it pertains to the ways that they're experiencing the world, what makes it hard for some folks to hear it is because that wasn't the world that they experienced. So now you're asking them, deny the world that you've lived in for your whole life so that you can understand these other people's world. And that's hard. Cognitive dissonance, holding two competing ideas in your head at the same time, it causes literal cognitive pain. That's part of the reason that people will push back so hard. When we're in pain, you have fight, flight, or freeze. And so for some people, the only way to keep the world as they've seen it their whole life is to fight against anything that questions or changes that. So addressing it with other people is hard because we've already missed a lot of those formative years. And I think one of your fellow board members mentioned starting very early intervention. It's almost like we're doing this so that future generations are not going to have to meet the same resistance and have to have the same fights. The folks that you have in your community who are pushing back against this work, your response, you have to be careful not to have that visceral, like just human response. It needs to have some support and some backing. And that's really why the report is so straightforward, is the intention is to say, here is some research, here's what the student said, here's what the teacher said, here is the themes that came out of it, and here are the suggestions. And in order to make sure that it was very clear that we're having a conversation about something that is real and has evidence. So it's complicated to be able to address folks in the community who don't agree with this work. The reason that they don't agree with this work is because this work didn't exist before or wasn't done to the same degree before. So that's the whole chicken or egg part of it. In terms of addressing folks right now, you have to be earnest and say, this is what we are doing because it's what's best for all of our students. We want, and I know I said this in our last meeting together, if the goal, our goal as educators, is to turn out the most thoughtful, prepared to deal with anything that comes at them in the world, students, people who are going to be well-informed citizens who make good decisions, they have to hear as much as they can. They have to hear multiple perspectives, and they have to develop their own critical thinking skill. Hiding information from them doesn't do that. Hiding information from them limits what they're able to know and what they're able to do and what they're able to think about, what they're able to consider. And that's not what we're supposed to be doing as educators. We're not supposed to be sending them out into the world having really narrow worldviews. They have to decide what their worldview is going to be. So we present the information, we present it as many ways as we possibly can so that they can engage their own critical analysis, engage their own personal perspectives, and develop their understanding based on evidence as opposed to based on, the things that were kept away from them. I know, once again, that's a very long, rambling response, but I hope I answered you a little bit there.
No, thank you very much.
Any other questions?
This board, Don, is familiar with long rambling responses. I don't know who exposed them to that, but they're very familiar with it.
Arnold?
Thank you very much, Dr. Seiler. Really appreciate your presentation on top of the report. Super helpful. I think it's maybe perhaps more of a comment than a question, but I found it really interesting, but not necessarily surprising when you said that when you moved from the group of 30 students down to the group of 8 that were Black and Latinx students, how the conversation, the mood changed, the conversation became a little more free-willed in. I think that's probably goes to the fact that they had kind of a shared experience, particularly as it relates to being in Guilford schools, but also Guilford as a town. Having done work in this area myself, both in academics, but also in professional environments, when there's a big group trying to wrestle through these issues, it's always like really awkward and touch and go for the first several weeks usually, and it's not until later in the semester or weeks into the program that people start to finally open up on all sides and with all perspectives. So I think that insight that you gave really speaks to how much we do need to be working on this. So it is very important work. You also said how they would resort to humor to kind of explain situations, but it's like the old saying, if you don't laugh, you'll cry. So again, it's very important work. I appreciate the report, and obviously we're here, especially the new board members. Most of us were elected on this premise that we're here to support this.
One thing I do want to mention that I didn't include it in the report because it was my own personal observation. In doing this work before, something that I noticed that tends to happen is when minoritized students are in an environment where they are separated from other groups, there's a tendency to feel a little safer and a little bit more comfortable, and therefore express themselves a little more. Black and Latinx Hispanic groups are, there's been research on just the communal nature of those groups, and that's why there's that tendency towards being more verbose and talking over each other and kind of bouncing around. But another thing that I wanted to, my observation that's separate from everything else is each time I've done this work with students, consistently, empathy shows up in a strange way, in that empathy and worry show up in a strange way, in that Black students and Hispanic students will tend to not necessarily share the depth of their experiences or how their experiences made them feel. because they don't want to hurt the feelings of their white peers. That has been consistent across the board. I've done this work with multiple other school districts, and that has always happened. And it's not, part of it is that they don't want to hurt their feelings. They also don't want to, you notice in the report, I mentioned the one student who said, there are these stereotypes about me being angry and always complaining. They also don't want to engage the stereotypes. But the one that surprises me consistently is that they will actually verbalize the fact that I didn't want my peers to feel bad. I didn't want to talk about this experience because I didn't want my white peers to feel bad. I didn't want them to feel guilty. So this was not, part of it is self-preservation, but there's another part of it that's empathy. That is them genuinely caring about their peers and not wanting them to feel pain. Partially because they themselves have felt it, they themselves have experienced it. All of our students have felt pain. But specific, racial and cultural pain, those are specific to different groups. But that empathy thing is one, that's the observation that really all keeps surprising me, is that these students don't want to hurt the feelings of their white peers. They don't want to upset them, but there's an aspect of it that is like, I don't want to cause pain because of my experience, if that makes sense.
Christy?
Yep, thank you. Just one last thing. I feel like I've talked too much, but just your bullet point about how important it is to make the aggrieved feel whole. I don't really have a discussion for it. I just want to touch upon, that really stands out to me as incredibly important. But as you pointed out, it also stands out as incredibly challenging in that, the privacy concerns and the way, I've heard stories, if there's a concern that a parent thinks something wasn't done on the other end to a child, people want to know that something's been done, and the districts are in a tough place that they cannot share that. So I think you started to touch upon it a little bit, but, just in general for future discussions, I am, curious about how to think about this in another way. What could this look like?
I do think that restorative practices are the go-to. Some of the problems with restorative practices is that they will sometimes put the onus on the aggrieved to forgive, which is once again putting all of the pressure on them. There are some aspects of restorative practices that take up more time. So why should the person who's already been injured have to then sacrifice more time to help the other person feel better? So, and I'm not saying that that's always bad. I'm saying that we're always asking something more, or there's a tendency to ask something more of someone who's already felt some injury. But there are other offshoots of restorative practices. There are other ideas that are being put into play in other spaces that look at how to make the student feel whole, once again, without addressing, what the other student dealt with. And some of it is even as straightforward as counseling. Some of it is having, specific support staff for those things. But your district would have to decide what the best kind of amalgam that they could put together would be.
Thank you.
We're getting, Katie, are we attempting to end this by 7:30?
I think probably out of respect for Dr. Seiler's time, but I saw Dr. Freeman just unmute himself.
So I was going to say exactly that. We don't have the same hard stop that we would have had last week with the necessity to go into a 7:30 public meeting that begins. But we had scheduled this with Dr. Seiler on the idea of a hard stop at 7:30. So I would ask that we try to respect that or come as close to respecting that as we can.
Okay. Well, the reason I ask is I was trying to figure out a way of starting to bring this to closure. And one of the observations I would make is that a lot of your report and the presentation really has a common theme, which is culture. That we have a lot of subcultures, whether it's the professional subculture or the community cultures, the different community subcultures, the board culture, the administrative culture, and we've got to work through that. And if those cultures aren't shared through things like common language or common content or common experience, which is why I like the label of an experiential panel, then we are not going to get to where we have to go in any case. But I think we've now started probably months later than we had hoped to be, is we now have a wonderful beginning common experience around this report. And the question I have, in part, I think for Paul, is how do we now, our committee structure is such that we don't meet very often as committees. And while this may fall under the purview of the curriculum committee, there's also a policy part, but how do we begin to take this report and develop a strategy, let's say a 5-year strategy that says, here's what we want to do at each of these cultural levels. How do we go about that? How do we get people to take leadership roles? And how do we do that in a way that does justice to things like budgeting decisions? So we don't have a particular line that deals with this in this budget, but the implication is for the recommendations that there are time resources, there are curricular resources, there are meeting resources, and there's financial resources, all of which at some point have to be optimized over time and may have in either the short term, medium, or long financial considerations. So how do we have a conversation about how to best keep this on the forefront, not the sole focus, but one that doesn't lurch from 3 months between meetings, where the board, as Arnold said earlier, said the board, and a large part of the board now got elected on this issue. How do we now make this an ongoing part of our cultural conversation in a way that is strategic?
So I really appreciate that question. I think that what the board does is allows us a very short turnaround time to begin talking about these recommendations in-house among the leadership team, but in short order comes to one of our workshop scheduled meetings where I can begin reporting out specifically on the recommendations. I think the most important part of tonight and of having this report in its entirety live on our website, which it will begin doing tomorrow morning, is that we have Dr. Seiler's methodology and experience and data there. But what we need to start talking about are those recommendations. And we can update the board on some of those where we believe we've started to make progress. We can identify some that appear to be things that we can address in relatively short order. And we can tease out others that may need to stand as more lighthouse or more long-term goals. And that's a similar approach that we followed with Dr. Borland's report, which we got those number of years ago. And so I think if not at your next workshop meeting, at the one following that, you will see this as a recommendation. And we need to, I think that the instinct is right. We can't only have these conversations at CIA meetings when Dr. Seiler is with us. We now take those recommendations and we start talking together as a leadership team, and we get comfortable moving different recommendations at different rates. We don't do this, right? And it's also, this isn't something where the board is going to look at those 8 recommendations and we're going to call for a big vote where each of you vote to accept or adopt. It becomes this organic experience, and it is a bit of a roadmap. But it's not the same kind of roadmap that you get on your phone when you Google map something. It's not clear steps and clear turns. It is much more of a compass that is pointing us generally westward, and we need to keep moving generally westward. Some of these will move more quickly than others, but we need to keep making progress on all of them. So I'm looking forward to that next conversation at an upcoming workshop meeting.
Thank you.
Dr. Hirsch, if I may for a second, I mean, Dr. Friedman, so much of this work, right, is as you say, is work the administration needs to discuss. You need to discuss with teachers. You really need to think about next steps. It seems to me, given the nature of our community, that the board not only has a pretty important role here in terms of supporting the administration, supporting our students, creating policy that does that, but also in a larger framework, helping our community support them in kind of understanding this work better, why it's so important to us, et cetera. And I'm not suggesting at all that we do that in any way misaligned with the administration's work, but I look forward to kind of a full discussion of how we as board members can really support this on multiple levels, because I think we have an important role here in its ultimate success. Not to overstate our role, but I just want to. I think there are things in Dr. Silo in your report that really speak to a role that we have. Again, whether it's helping to support policy or other things. So I too really like the idea of using workshop meetings for this, so that we can all together figure out how that work aligns.
And I think there's another really important role for the regular business meetings in public comment, right? I think a lot of people in this community have been waiting to see this and to read this report. And I really hope that people put in the time to read the report, view this meeting, and then come out and speak to the board, right? Right, both formally and informally. We really want to hear from people about what this report means to them and what their expectations are of us as we do that planning work moving forward. I've been getting a lot of questions over the first half of this year about when this report was going to be released. I know that we've thanked Dr. Seiler a lot tonight, but his patience and persistence in doing this work over the most disrupted 18 months of public education that has ever occurred is really appreciated. He has stuck with this and with us through some real ups and downs in getting him access to teachers, to the students, in the time that he needed to be able to put this together. So I'm excited to hear what the community thinks once all of this becomes available to them tomorrow, as well as continuing our conversations in public about what we're going to do with it all.
The point that Katie makes, I think, is important. I mean, the board is in some sense the sandwich meat between the larger community and the school system. And we know that the larger community is going to be questioning this. They don't have quite the same context that we have. My concern is that by putting this up on the website as the primary communication to the community will probably be inadequate. And how does one begin to have a community-wide conversation? And this may be the important conversation for the board to have. How do we now have a conversation with the community, which was really requested of us during the election? The request for transparency, the accusations that we have been clandestine, or we have a hidden agenda, the fact that we don't listen, or the fact that I hope people will be surprised that this report and the conversation tonight demonstrates that there's not 10 books or a particular kind of curriculum we're about to impose, that this is just going to do something that we've always had in mind. So to me, this is the beginning of an opportunity for a community conversation, whether it means we go out and small group meetings or get invited to the Lions Club or to what have you. How do we do that in a way that we can begin to close the gap between various cultures so that we're starting to experience both same language and concepts? So this to me is a beautiful baseline, a foundation on which to start, as opposed to people coming in the second act.
And I think that's a really important point. And I don't know if it was listening to Don talk about social media, but I'm becoming more aware that when we talk about having a conversation, we need to be clear with our community that what we mean by that is lots of various multiple opportunities through various media, right? Going to the Rotary Club, going to PTO meetings, and having small, intimate conversations. It doesn't necessarily mean one big assembly or forum that gets done in 3 hours and meets everybody's needs. I don't think that that's how we digest informations and have conversations as communities anymore. It's not one big town hall meeting or one big Lincoln Douglas debate that's going to resolve everything definitively. It's lots of small running conversations through various media that help a community to come to understand and move forward on this stuff. And so I do think we may need to rethink our strategy, and sometimes it will probably of necessity include those big events, but I think we need to think about the smaller events and the smaller ways of pushing information and receiving feedback and figure out how we work those channels.
Any last comments or questions before we draw this to a close? Dr. Seiler, again, thank you. This has been most educational in the best sense, and we appreciate it. I hope we see you again, and I would now entertain a motion to adjourn. Jennifer, second?
Second.
All in favor? Any opposed? Thank you very much.
Thank you all, and Dr. Seiler, Don, thank you again. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Glad to do it. Y'all take care.
Thank you, Dr. Seiler.